For more and more people, politics has become their religion. As we have lost or abandoned faith or religion as the framework of our spirituality, we have adopted politics in its place. The value systems of politics are profoundly different from those of faith organizations. Good and evil are expressed in terms of win and lose. The primary value that drives all other values is money. On Sunday, September the 18th, 2022, on the front page of the New York Times, there appeared a color picture of an American flag. It is a flag that looks old and worn, perhaps a flag that has been through a battle and barely survived. The color is dull, it is soiled in places, the edges are frayed, and it's coming unraveled. The headline below the picture reads, "Democracy Challenged." The article is written by a man named David Leonhardt. It captures the fear that seems to be expressed in conversations I have had on an almost daily basis. There is something deeply wrong happening in our world. It is a sickness not limited to the United States, but we seem to be leading the way on a path toward authoritarian government maintained by violence. It is entirely possible, if not likely, that we have progressed so far that recovery is no longer possible. If you aren't concerned, you haven't been listening. The current period is different, he says. As a result, the United States today finds itself in a situation with little historical precedent. American democracy is facing two distinct threats. The first is acute. A growing movement inside one of the country's two major political parties, the Republican Party, to refuse to accept defeat in an election. The second threat to democracy is chronic, but also growing. The power to set government policy is becoming increasingly disconnected from public opinion. We know that something is terribly wrong. We know it isn't working. We don't see a path forward to hold on to the ideals we used to take for granted, even when we failed to live up to them. We don't know what kind of world we will live in next week, much less what we will leave for our children and grandchildren. How we got here is an important question, but it's not simple. There is no single factor. It takes a serious and objective look at how this country was formed and how more than 400 years of history have unfolded. It is easy to bog down in an argument about democracy versus republic. The founding fathers, the authors of the Constitution, were not saints, and they were not perfect. They got a lot of things right, but they got some other things wrong. They understood their imperfections better than we do. We are where we are, regardless of how we got here. I believe the problem is fundamentally spiritual. Spirituality and religion are two different things. The problem for religion, all religions, is that it is in search of the truth. It is a noble pursuit and a journey that is essential for the development of one's humanity. But the journey to the truth is a lifelong undertaking. The church becomes a suppressor of spirituality when it presumes to proclaim the fullness of absolute truth in answer to all questions. I tend to be suspicious of those who have all the answers and are eager to tell me what God wants. The late Bennett Sims, once the Episcopal Bishop of Atlanta, wrote in a book called Purple Ink of what he called a hierarchy of truth. There are different kinds of truth, each one moving higher in value or deeper in meaning, whichever metaphor you prefer. Other people have written about the same thing, and all the descriptions of truth vary, which should come as no surprise. It's not science. But what has been meaningful and helpful to me is this. The first level of truth is empirical truth. It is the truth of facts. demonstrable and it can be verified. This is a podium, it's not a bicycle. The vast majority of truth that we encounter daily is empirical truth. The second level of truth is the truth of myth. A myth is not another word for falsehood. Literarily, a myth is a story about God or the gods. The story of creation in the Bible is a myth. The meaning of the story can be explored and expressed. People can speculate about what the story is about, but the explanation doesn't carry the truth as well as the story. Truth is often spoken with more power in story than in the explanation. Sometimes the explanation just muddies the water and we wind up missing the point. Just tell the story. A deeper level of truth is the truth of paradox. A paradox consists of two statements that seem to be mutually exclusive of each other, but each must be held to be true if the fullness of the truth is to be expressed. The Christian faith is filled with paradox. God is sovereign. Humanity has free will. It can't be both, but it is. One without the other is something less than true. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled, once said, "The only great truth that can be expressed without paradox is love makes the world go round." Perhaps the deepest level of truth is the truth of mystery. Mystery is truth that can only be known through experience. It isn't something that can be taught. It can only be done. Love is, I believe, one of the great truths. And love is a real thing. We can talk about it, and God knows we do a lot of that. We can describe actions that we think are loving and actions that are unloving. We can speak of our personal experience of what it feels like to love, though almost all such descriptions are poetic or metaphorical. We can commit ourselves to love. We can reject the notion of love. We can try to live a life of cynicism. We can teach our children to behave in ways that we have come to think of as loving, but we can't really define it. In fact, forcing a definition of love often has the effect of smothering it. We can only live it or not live it. There are those who suggest that there is a kind of mystery truth that is even deeper, universal truth. It's beyond experience. It's just as true. It's true everywhere. The interconnectedness of all humanity is a universal truth. The inherent value of life is a universal truth. It doesn't have to be taught. It is just known. And those who don't know it are in some way broken. I don't really believe there is absolute truth beyond empirical truth this side of the kingdom. In the Christian church, the Nicene Creed was written in its final or almost final form in 327, the Christian era. It is the codification of what Christian church has believed for almost the entirety of its existence. That is something worth remembering. But it isn't the whole truth. It isn't the only truth. It is a theological expression of the meaning of life, the meaning of the faith, which changes as the perspectives of those who read it or recite it change. When we believe in the absolute truth, it is but a short step to believing it should be the truth for all people. Scott Peck defines humility as giving serious consideration to the possibility that we may be wrong. And given the numbers of religions and the varieties of belief, even within the same religion, it seems a mathematical reality that no one person, no one body of people has gotten it right. Insistence on my story being true, only my story being true, is incredible arrogance. Spirituality isn't so much about the quest for truth. Spirituality is about how we understand ourselves in relation to the world around us. How do we live in and with all creation? Spirituality is about how we are connected to that which is beyond us, that which is greater than we are. Christians call it God. Islam calls it Allah. and AA members call it a higher power. Spirituality has to do with where and how we find ultimate meaning in life. The human condition is such that we are blessed and cursed with self-awareness. It is self-awareness that gives us the capacity to laugh and to love. Self-awareness also gives us the awareness of our mortality. We know we will surely die. How do we find meaning in life in the face of death? Many of us do so by denying the reality of death. We simply ignore it. That works reasonably well for the most part and for most of the time. It also limits our ability to have meaningful relationship with other people. Denial of death limits our ability to love at the deepest level. There is just too much vulnerability involved. I once had a call from a man who was in the hospital dying from lung cancer. He wasn't a church person, and he had little interest in spiritual things. He was in his mid-50s, a self-made millionaire who had risen high on the corporate ladder of success. He had a large home, a vacation house, a lot of toys, and not a whole lot of time to enjoy them. He had a teenage son, but they were not close. You know how it goes. His wife was a church person, and she had suggested that he call me. I went to see him in the hospital. He said he wasn't afraid of dying, and I believed him. He said he had always known it was the natural end of all living things. He wished it could have been longer, later, for sure. But he also knew that no time is a good time. It was just what it was. He wasn't a man of faith, and he wasn't worried about the destination of his soul. He hadn't called me to hear his confession. He called me because the foundation of what he knew to be important had been turned upside down. He must have said 50 times, what was it all about? What was it for? Why doesn't it make any sense? I tried to talk to him about the good things of his life. I tried to talk to him about love, the people he loved, the people who loved him. I don't know that that meant anything to him. Why doesn't it make sense, he would say. And maybe that was okay. Maybe that was all there was for him. Maybe he enjoyed it while he could. And that was the only meaning there was. In the introduction of the Declaration of Independence are the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's not science. It's not empirical truth. It is couched in the language of faith, but it is not religion. It is the truth of wisdom. It is spiritual. In 1981, James W. Fowler, professor of theology and human development in Emory University in Atlanta, published a book called Stages of Faith, The Psychology of Human Development. In the book, he presents evidence to support the theory that human beings go through a process of faith development that are parallel to personality development. It's not simple and clear-cut. It's possible to go backwards. It's possible to get stuck at one stage for the entirety of one's life. It caused quite a stir at the time, and there have been variations that describe the stages. The thing that impressed me enough to remember was the premise that all people are spiritual. It may well be evolutional in the development of human nature, but it isn't our DNA. It isn't a question of whether we have spirituality, but rather what we do with it. We can engage it, we may work at it, and we may let it stay at the level of a child. We may ignore it, but it is a part of us. It shapes what we believe. It shapes what we value. Spirituality and religion are truly different, but there is a close connection. For several millennia, Most people develop spirituality in the context of some religious framework. There are three things that are common to every civilization that has ever been discovered in history, all the way back to cave dwellers. Those three things are art, music, and worship. All are expressions of spirituality rather than technology or scientific advancement. The structure, the discipline, if you will, of religion provides a framework to conceptualize, articulate the ways in which we have developed spiritually. Faith structure offers values that become the core of how life itself is understood. They are values such as love, the sanctity of life, compassion, and empathy. Every major world religion has some expression of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A quick Google search renders the concept is in Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and the rest of the world's religions. It isn't a religious law. It is a spiritual reality of what it means to be fully human. Of course, throughout the history of civilization, not all people in any culture have lived by universally accepted values, but they have been generally accepted as universal values. The ideals may not always have been things we incorporated into our daily lives, but we honored them. They were the things that gave life meaning. They were noble. Religious institutions began to lose their influence at least 100 years ago. Actually, I place the beginning of the decline in Christianity at 1543, when Copernicus published his observation that the earth was not the center of the universe, but rather revolved around the sun. The book was not published until the year after his death, and it caused little, if any, stir. Copernicus got a lot of things wrong. The notion of a solar system occupying an insignificant corner of a vast universe was beyond his comprehension. He didn't know about gravity, so orbits were a bit of a mystery. The science of his time believed that when you dropped a rock, it fell to the ground because the earth was the center of everything. But the cat was out of the bag nonetheless. The church fought back, suppressing the book and extinguishing what was thought to be heresy in every way possible. It took maybe 300 years for the impact to reach regular people, but eventually the self-centered illusion of being the reason for creation collapsed. The age of enlightenment and the unfolding of scientific methodology eroded the strong, if simple and superstitious, faith of the common folk. As is true in most social shifts, the decline of religion began slowly and then gathered momentum almost imperceptibly at first, until it gathered great speed. Until sometime in the 1970s, the Christian church in this country pretty much held its own, though there were signs even then that the seams were weakening and things were beginning to unravel. Beginning in the 1980s or 1990s, the drop in church or synagogue attendance was precipitous. It wasn't all religious institutions, of course. There were many exceptions. But it was widespread. Before COVID, my sense is that church attendance was half or less than half of what it had been a decade before. Faith is no longer an anchor in the lives of many people. I have come to the conclusion that as we have lost or abandoned faith or religion as the framework of our spirituality, we have adopted politics in its place. We are fundamentally spiritual beings, and spirituality will find expression. Of course, that is not universally true, or maybe not even the case for most people. There's still many people who believe in the fundamental values of most faiths, but an increasing number of people no longer find that source of belief relevant. For more and more people, politics has become their religion. There are a lot of similarities. Politics has creeds, there's Holy Scripture, there are denominations, there are saints, there is a mythology. More can be said about that, but in terms of these remarks, the important thing is the value systems of politics are profoundly different from those of faith organizations. Good and evil are expressed in terms of win and lose. The primary value that drives all other values is money. That's nothing new. There have always been moral conflicts around money. The first epistle of Timothy in the New Testament says the love of money is the root of all evil, and that was written close to 2,000 years ago. The idolization of money is nothing new, but it's different in recent years. There is no tension. The goal of life has become to amass as much fortune as possible. There's no apology for greed. There is no attempt to dress it up as something else and make it look okay. It has become a fundamental value. The religion of politics is not simple. It is complex and complicated, and much more needs to be said. That is for another day.